Hey guys, welcome back. Tonight, we're stepping into one of the most secretive and unsettling corners of ancient Egypt, the sleep rituals that were never meant for ordinary people. The rituals that blurred the line between rest and death. For the next 2 hours, we'll explore why pharaohs slept on stone pillows sharp enough to damage the spine. Why priests guarded...
Hey guys, welcome back. Tonight, we're stepping into one of the most secretive and unsettling corners of ancient Egypt. The sleep rituals that were never meant for ordinary people. The rituals that blurred the line between rest and death. For the next 2 hours, we'll explore why pharaohs slept on stone pillows sharp enough to damage the spine. Why priests guarded sleeping bodies as if protecting souls mid-flight. And why Egyptians believed a single mistake during sleep could open the door to the afterlife too early. These weren't just bedtime habits, they were rehearsals for death itself. Quiet, sacred, and terrifyingly precise. So before you get comfortable, take a gentle moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if these deep sleep history stories help you find peace, sleep better, or simply reflect on our shared journey through time. Now, close your eyes. Let the desert wind soften around you, and allow yourself to drift into a world where even dreams could choose who lived and who didn't.
Tonight, as the world around you softens and the edges of your thoughts begin to blur, we enter one of the strangest, quietest, and most dangerous sleep rituals in all of ancient Egypt. Before the priests opened the sacred oils, before the body was wrapped in linen, before the 70-day journey of mummification even began, there was a small, cold, deceptively simple object placed beneath the neck of the dead. A stone pillow. Hard, unforgiving, 3,000 years old, and yet carved with a precision that whispers of a knowledge far older than the stones themselves. The first time archaeologists uncovered these granite and alabaster pillows in KV 62, the tomb of Tutankhamun, they were confused. Why would the Egyptians, who mastered comfort in life, the perfumes, the linen beds, the feather headrests, choose something so brutally hard for their kings in death? The answer, it turns out, is darker than anyone expected. Because these pillows were not designed for comfort, they were designed for control. When you look at them closely, you see a deep, curved groove carved specifically to hold the neck. The curve matches the cervical spine almost perfectly, so precisely that modern anatomists were startled when they compared the shape to X-rays of the human vertebrae. But here is the unsettling truth. This shape doesn't cradle the neck gently, it locks it in place. Modern sleep researchers know that when the cervical spine is kept in an extended, rigid position, especially on an unyielding surface, blood flow changes, muscles tighten, breathing becomes shallow, and the sleeper hovers in a dangerous, half-dreaming state,
unable to fall into deep sleep. Ancient Egyptians wanted this. They believed deep sleep was risky, that the soul might wander too far from the body, might lose its way, might never return at sunrise. And so the stone pillow forced the king to stay close to consciousness, hovering at the edge of dreams, aware enough to hear the gods, but never relaxed enough to surrender completely. Tomb inscriptions from the Valley of the Kings describe pharaohs experiencing nights of divine unrest, where sleep came in fragments, light, thin, trembling. The Egyptians believed this sleep deprivation connected the king to the suffering of the gods themselves. They called it divine burden, a sacred fatigue that mirrored the eternal labor of Ra, carrying the sun across the sky. To suffer in sleep was to be closer to heaven. But there is more. The hard pillow didn't just keep the soul from drifting, it also protected the body. The Egyptians believed that if the head tilted too far back during sleep, the breath of life could escape, leaving the body vulnerable to evil spirits. The stone pillow prevented this by anchoring the head firmly, refusing to let it fall into the vulnerable softness of deep rest. Thousands of years later, modern medical research echoes this ancient belief in its own unexpected way. Studies show that extremely firm pillows elevate stress hormones, reduce oxygen flow, and strain the cervical vertebrae. Some sleep scientists even note that improper neck elevation during sleep increases the risk of micro-injuries, dizziness upon waking, and spine inflammation. What was once spiritual danger now appears as physiological risk. And yet, despite its harshness, the stone pillow held meaning far beyond fear. For the Egyptians, suffering in sleep was not punishment. It was purification. It was the narrowing of the path between the mortal and the divine. It was endurance as devotion.
As we continue drifting deeper into the shadows of this ancient ritual, I want you to imagine the quietest moment inside the royal burial chamber, the moment when the stone pillow was placed beneath the neck of a pharaoh for the very last time. The lamplight flickered. The incense curled upward in thin white strands. Every movement slowed, as though time itself was holding its breath. The attendants approached with both reverence and fear, because they believed the slightest mistake could disturb the fragile boundary between this world and the next. The stone pillow, cool and heavy, was lifted with two hands. Its curved groove, carved 3 millennia earlier, waited like an open mouth ready to receive the weight of a king's final breath. When the head touched the stone, a faint, hollow sound echoed through the chamber, a sound that ancient texts call the settling of the soul. To the modern ear, it was simply the tap of bone against granite, but to the Egyptians, that sound marked the moment the king crossed the threshold into divine awareness. The Egyptians believed the back of the neck was the point where the soul anchored to the body. Pressure on that area, especially from hard surfaces, was thought to awaken spiritual senses. And, strangely enough, modern anatomy reveals a tiny cluster of nerves at that exact point, sensitive enough to trigger changes in breath and heart rhythm when pressed. The Egyptians didn't need microscopes to understand this. They felt it. They observed it. They built an entire sleep ritual around it. But the danger came from something else. The stone pillow did not simply hold the pharaoh's head, it forced the cervical spine into a raised, overextended position. Today, doctors warn that such a posture can reduce blood flow to the brainstem, strain the vertebrae, and even cause temporary neurological disorientation. For an ordinary sleeper, this might mean dizziness or stiffness. For someone already weakened, like a pharaoh in his final days, it could trigger the very thing the priests feared most, the slipping away of breath during sleep. This is why the ritual was considered dangerous. Some inscriptions from Saqqara mention kings who slept too deeply and did not rise. Scholars debate whether these lines referred to myth or medicine, but the risk was real. The Egyptians believed that sleep could claim a life as easily as illness. Yet, for the pharaohs, the risk was part of the path. Sleep deprivation was seen as a sacred offering. And so their nights, even in life, were often short and restless. In KV 62, the tomb of Tutankhamun, archaeologists found patterns of wear on the stone pillow, tiny abrasions that suggest it was used not only in death, but perhaps during the young king's lifetime. Imagine a 14-year-old boy king lying awake under a desert sky, his head resting on cold stone, listening to the distant chants of priests, unable to sink fully into the safety of sleep. There was a belief that a king who slept too peacefully lost touch with the divine, and so they kept his nights shallow, light, filled with half-dreams. In one inscription, a high priest wrote, "A king must taste the bitterness of night, so he may know the sweetness of dawn." It is poetic, it is beautiful, and it is also heartbreaking, because behind that belief lies the constant fatigue of a ruler who never truly rested.
And now, as we reach the quiet end of this first chapter, let us step deeper into the mystery of why a ritual so simple, laying a head upon a stone pillow, was both sacred and potentially deadly. Because the true reason lies not only in the object itself, but in the beliefs wrapped around it like linen around a mummy. The Egyptians feared chaotic sleep. They feared dreams that wandered too far. And above all, they feared the moment when the boundary between life and death grew thin enough for the soul to slip through unnoticed. The stone pillow, with its unyielding surface and sharp curve, prevented the head from falling backward during deep sleep. This may sound small, almost insignificant, but in the ancient worldview, sleep was the closest thing to death a person experienced each night. They believed that the soul, called the Ba, rose from the body during sleep, drifting like a bird, exploring worlds unseen. If the body became too relaxed, too vulnerable, the Ba could lose its anchor. And so pharaohs slept on stone, hard, elevated, restrictive, not to comfort the body, but to restrain the soul. This is why tomb inscriptions often describe sleep kept shallow by wisdom, a poetic phrase that scholars once dismissed as metaphor,
until medical studies revealed that firm sleeping surfaces truly reduce REM sleep, shorten dream cycles, and keep the brain locked in lighter, more vigilant stages of rest. In other words, the Egyptians accidentally created a perfect tool for limiting deep sleep. But they didn't view this limitation as weakness. They saw it as strength. A pharaoh who dreamed too deeply was considered spiritually undisciplined. A king who hovered at the threshold, never fully resting, never fully slipping away, was believed to be in constant conversation with the divine. Yet this came at a cost written not in ink, but in the bones of the kings themselves. When modern researchers examined the mummies of several royal lineages, they found signs of cervical strain, compressed vertebrae, worn joints, misaligned neck bones, evidence of years, perhaps decades, sleeping on surfaces too hard for the human body. And while the priests saw this as devotion, it was also quiet suffering, a type of pain the Egyptians believed brought a ruler closer to the gods who labored endlessly to maintain cosmic order. They called this pain divine suffering, a sacred fatigue that marked the king as chosen. The danger, however, was always present. On certain nights, especially during the final purification rituals, the pharaoh slept less than 3 hours. Tomb texts mention episodes where the breath of the king faltered in the depth of night. Some scholars believe these were early descriptions of airway collapse, something modern medicine recognizes all too well in rigid neck positions. And yet, despite these risks, the ritual endured for centuries, because in ancient Egypt the point was not comfort, but transcendence. And in that transcendence, even the threat of death became meaningful.
Tonight, as your breath softens and your body settles into stillness, we move from the stone pillows of Pharaohs into something even stranger, the sleep rhythm that shaped an entire civilization. The Egyptians did not sleep the way we do. They didn't sink into one long night of rest. Instead, their nights rose and fell in a rhythm so ancient, so deeply woven into the Nile's heartbeat, that modern researchers still struggle to understand its precision. It was a 3-hour cycle, a pattern described in medical papyri, etched into tomb walls and whispered through the writings of priests who studied the stars. To the Egyptians, sleep came in 2 parts, the first sleep and the second sleep. Between them was a quiet interval, a still window in the middle of the night when the world lay half awake. During that time, Egyptians believed the air thinned, the veil between realms softened, and the mind became clearer than at any other moment of the day. In some households, lamps were lit. In others, people simply lay still, breathing with the desert breeze. A noble might rise, drink cool water from an alabaster cup,
or write a short prayer to Hathor. Workers might simply stretch their legs, shift their weight, whisper to a sleeping child beside them. This intersleep interval was not an interruption. It was part of the night, a natural pause, like the quiet breath held between two waves. But the Egyptians followed this pattern not only because of culture, but because of the river. The Nile's circadian influence was subtle yet powerful. The river breathed with the moon, its sound changing ever so slightly with the tides, guiding the sleep of those who lived along its banks. During the dry season, when the water was low and calm, nights were quieter, sleep lasted longer, dreams deepened. But in the flood season, when the Nile swelled with distant rains, the rumbling water reshaped the night. People woke more often, their sleep grew lighter, tuned to the shifting pulse of the river. And in this natural ebb and flow, Egyptians came to believe that the body was meant to rest, rise, then rest again. 3 hours, then awakening. 3 hours, then dawn. Even their astronomy echoed this rhythm. Priests charted the rising of the Orion constellation, known to them as Sa, the celestial counterpart of Osiris. On certain nights, Orion appeared at the exact midpoint between first sleep and second sleep. This moment became sacred, a cosmic reminder that even stars rested in cycles. And yet, not everyone shared the same rhythm. Nobles, sleeping on soft linen sheets perfumed with lotus, followed the two-sleep pattern gently, like breathing. Workers, however, slept in bursts. Their days began before sunrise and ended long after dusk. Papyrus complaints found in Deir el-Medina reveal workers exhausted by irregular nights, waking too early for labor shifts, or staying up late to finish mandatory quotas. One worker wrote bitterly, "Sleep is taken from my eyes as sand is taken from the riverbed." It is one of the oldest descriptions of sleep deprivation in human history. And still, the pattern endured, because whether noble or worker, everyone lived under the same sky, the same river, the same quiet pauses in the night. Even modern sleep science has begun to validate what the Egyptians practiced naturally. Researchers have discovered that humans, when placed in darkness without modern schedules, naturally return to the first sleep, second sleep rhythm. A gentle waking around midnight, a calm hour of thought, then a second descent into sleep. What the Egyptians followed was not superstition. It was biology, tuned to the rhythm of a river that sustained life for thousands of years.
As we drift deeper into the rhythm of ancient nights, imagine the way sleep settled across the desert the moment the sun slipped behind the western horizon. The sky dimmed into purple, then into a deep indigo, and for a brief moment the entire land fell silent, as if the world were exhaling. This was the beginning of the first sleep, predictable, steady, a descent into rest shaped not by clocks, but by stars. Egyptian medical papyri describe this first sleep in quiet, poetic terms. The body cools, the breath slows, the shadow of the soul begins to rise. It lasted roughly 3 hours, though no one counted minutes. They counted feelings. The gentle heaviness in the limbs, the weightlessness in the chest, the subtle sweetness of drifting. And then, almost like a tide changing direction, the body shifted. A soft awakening came, a kind that modern people rarely feel anymore. Not a jolt, not an alarm, just a slow resurfacing, as though the sleeper were rising through warm water into the blue of dawn. This moment mattered deeply to the Egyptians. They believed it was the point where the soul, having wandered lightly through dreams, returned close enough to the body to be listened to. Some nobles used this moment to pray. Some scribes used it to write, believing their minds sharper in this interval. Some farmers simply sat at the door of their mud brick homes, listening to insects hum across the fields. Even the animals followed this rhythm. Oxen shifting in the dark, birds stirring on branches, cats pacing along the edges of courtyards. All of Egypt moved together in this shared pause. What made this pattern so powerful was how naturally it blended with the world around them. In the flood season, when the Nile roared louder than usual, people rose earlier. The sound was impossible to ignore. Heavy, vibrating, like the pulse of the earth. And so the population woke in waves, rolling upward from their reed mats, glancing through the dimness to check water levels, especially in the countryside where floods meant both life and danger. In the dry season, the river quieted. Nights were longer, sleep deeper, dreams more vivid. Inscriptions describe dreams of floating boats, glowing birds, or voices calling from distant dunes during these quieter months, dreams thought to be divine messages. The sleep cycle was not simply biological, it was seasonal, cosmic, living. But the Nile was only one guide. The stars were the other. Priests spent lifetimes studying the movements of constellations, especially Orion, Sa, the celestial shape of Osiris. Sa's rising and setting became markers for sleep and waking. When Orion touched a certain angle above the horizon, it signaled the midpoint of the night, the perfect moment to rise from the first sleep and let the mind hover in wakeful clarity. This was not superstition. It was astronomy with a spiritual heartbeat. And yet, not everyone followed the rhythm with the same ease. In elite households, sleep flowed like a slow river. Soft beds, fresh linen, cool rooms shaded with woven palm mats. But for workers, the nights were restless. Papyrus records found at Deir el-Medina describe men forced to adjust their sleep to impossible schedules. Night shifts to guard tombs, pre-dawn calls to gather tools, evening obligations to repair cracked walls or carve reliefs. One worker wrote with the weariness that echoes across time, "My eyes close in the darkness, but my sleep escapes me." Another noted that his 3-hour rhythm had collapsed entirely during flood season, leaving him dizzy during the day. These records, fragile and brown with age, are among the earliest documents of sleep disorders in human history. And yet, the pattern of first sleep and second sleep persisted even among the exhausted. No matter how disrupted, their bodies still attempted to rise between the two sleeps, if only for minutes, if only to sigh or stretch. Modern sleep science has replicated this phenomenon.
When people disconnect from artificial light and modern schedules, their bodies naturally fall back into this two-part night. 3 hours of deep rest, a soft awakening, then 3 more hours of sleep. It is not an invention of the past. It is our nature, buried under centuries of noise, light, and habit. And in Egypt, that nature was honored. It was woven into prayers, into calendars, into architecture. Even temple corridors were built to channel moonlight at midnight, the hour between sleeps, so priests could walk through soft silver light without carrying torches. It was a world where night was not a single shape, but a series of breaths.
As the night deepens in our journey, let us move into the most intimate layer of the Egyptian 3-hour sleep cycle, the way it shaped the emotional, spiritual, and physical life of a people who saw sleep not as rest, but as alignment with the universe. The Egyptians believed that the midpoint of the night, the quiet moment between the first and second sleep, was when the world grew thin, like silk stretched almost transparent under moonlight. In this window of stillness, the mind sharpened in a way modern science now recognizes as hypnagogic clarity. Thoughts flowed more slowly, like sand slipping through a narrow funnel. This was the hour when nobles composed letters, when priests whispered incantations, when astronomers climbed rooftop platforms to watch Orion rise. Even the simplest homes, made of mud brick and reed matting, embraced this rhythm. Families often sat awake together in the dim light, sharing soft conversations, checking the household fire, or simply listening to the river, to the wind, to the beating silence that fills the desert at midnight. This wasn't insomnia, it wasn't restlessness, it was cultural stillness, an intermission built into the night. And yet, the 3-hour rhythm was not merely spiritual, it was biological, dictated by the natural lighting of the moon and the seasonal behavior of the Nile. During the inundation, the flood season, the swollen river created a deep, continuous resonance, a low rumble like the earth humming under its breath. People often woke earlier during this season, their bodies responding to the vibrations through the ground. During the dry months, when the river narrowed and the nights cooled, people slept longer between their waking intervals. In both seasons, their bodies were obeying circadian cues modern science has rediscovered. Humans naturally sleep in 2 segments when freed from artificial light. But Egypt added another layer, the stars. The rising of Orion at the center of the night became a celestial clock, guiding millions. Many believed that the gods themselves used the stars to regulate human sleep, nudging people awake with the movement of constellations across the sky. Some priests even claimed they could feel a subtle change in the air when Orion reached its highest point, as though the heavens drew a long breath. Written records show that workers too navigated the 3-hour rhythm, though with pain rather than ease. In Deir el-Medina, the village of royal tomb builders, exhausted laborers described waking in the middle of the night not because of spiritual clarity, but because of physical hardship, aching backs, stiff limbs, or disrupted schedules imposed by overseers. One worker wrote on a pottery shard, "My body rises though my spirit wishes to sleep." Another described falling asleep during his second sleep, only to be shaken awake before dawn to begin work. Night has forgotten me. Their exhaustion formed the other side of Egypt's sleep story, the tension between natural rhythm and forced labor. Yet, even they, despite fatigue and duty, still fell instinctively into the pattern of first sleep and second sleep. Not even exhaustion could erase the ancient timing written into the human body. And so, throughout Egypt, from palace to workshop, from farm to temple, the land settled each night into a breathing pattern that matched the river, the sky, and the turning of seasons. 3 hours of descent, a gentle waking, 3 hours of surrender, dawn. And as modern research now shows, this was not merely tradition. It was one of the healthiest forms of sleep humanity ever practiced, aligned with natural melatonin cycles, moonlight exposure, and temperature shifts. In other words, the Egyptians were not just following the stars, they were following their biology. And tonight, as you listen, you're drifting closer to that ancient rhythm again, the rhythm that carried a civilization through thousands of years of silent, starlit nights.
Tonight, as we sink deeper into the quiet pulse of ancient Egypt, we enter one of the most fragile beliefs ever recorded in the Book of the Dead. The moment when the Ba, the wandering soul, leaves the sleeping body. To the Egyptians, sleep was not a simple rest. It was a rehearsal for death. Every night, without exception, the soul rose from the chest like a bird unfolding its wings, drifting into the world between worlds. It did not matter whether you were a worker sleeping on a reed mat or a pharaoh resting on carved alabaster, your Ba always wandered. But for kings, the stakes were far greater. The nation believed that if the pharaoh's soul failed to return at dawn, the balance of the world, Ma'at, would collapse. And so Egypt created one of the most extraordinary sleep protection systems in human history. The Book of the Dead describes priests who guarded sleeping kings. They were called night watchers, chosen for their purity and trained for years to read the subtle signs of a soul in danger. These priests did not sleep. They sat around the pharaoh in a circle, their backs straight, their hands resting on their knees. In the dim glow of an oil lamp, they recited silent spells. Spells meant not to wake the king, but to guide his soul home before sunrise. The Egyptians believed the soul was most vulnerable during two liminal thresholds, dusk and dawn. At dusk, the sun god Ra descended into the underworld, and the souls of humans followed the same path in miniature, slipping lightly out of their bodies as the world dimmed. At dawn, the danger was sharper. The soul, returning from the night journey, might arrive too late. If the sun rose before the soul re-entered the body, the person could fall into a coma-like state or die. This fear shaped everything from architecture to bedroom design. Many royal chambers had protective spells carved into their walls, lines of hieroglyphs arranged in soft flowing patterns meant to soothe, not intimidate. Ceilings were decorated with stars to remind the departing soul which direction to travel. Some ceilings even depicted the goddess Nut stretching her arms across the sky, welcoming the soul back into the world of breath. Physical methods of protection appeared too. Mirrors, polished bronze discs, were placed at the feet of sleepers to confuse hostile spirits. Amulets, carved with the eye of Horus, were laid beside the throat, guarding the point where the soul exited. Some pharaohs slept with small heart scarab charms directly under their linen pillow, believing it whispered instructions to the soul as it drifted. But even with all these protections, ancient texts record chilling incidents, cases where the soul did not return. In one such account, a young prince was found lying peacefully at dawn, his body warm, his face serene, but unresponsive. Priests declared that his ba had wandered beyond the borders and could not find its way back. The body lived a full day before slowly fading like a lamp burning its last oil. To the modern mind, this sounds like a stroke, cardiac event, or sudden nocturnal seizure. But to the Egyptians, it was spiritual disappearance, a soul that slipped through a crack in the world. And the consequences were immense. They believed a missing soul could become trapped in the duat, the shadow realm, forever unable to reunite with the Ka, the life force. This was the true death, not the end of the body, but the severing of identity. The Egyptians feared this more than anything, and so, night after night, they guarded their sleep with poetry, spells, and silence.
As we drift further into the dim corridors of ancient belief, imagine a pharaoh lying in the deep blue of night, his body still, his breathing slow, his soul lifting from him like a warm mist rising from desert sand. The Egyptians described this moment with extraordinary softness. They said the soul loosens itself, as though the body releases its grip, allowing the ba to drift upward and outward through the narrow passage of the throat. Every person experienced this nightly departure. But for the pharaoh, the moment was watched with reverence and fear. Around him, the night watchers sat completely still, their eyes half closed, their minds trained to notice even the faintest shift in breath or posture. They believed that when the soul left, the body grew slightly colder near the chest, like a candle drawing back its flame. Priests memorized this change. They feared the moment the body remained cold for too long. The Book of the Dead offers warnings. Guard the breath, guard the rising, guard the return. And so the priests waited in absolute silence, aware that the soul faced real dangers in the invisible world. At night, the Egyptians believed the Ba wandered through the Duat, a realm filled not only with guardians, but also with forces that could confuse or trap a wandering soul. Dawn was the most dangerous threshold. They believed the soul, returning from its journey, grew disoriented in the light of Ra's rebirth. If it hesitated, even briefly, the rising sun could seal the gate behind it. This is why Egyptian bedrooms were designed for the soul's guidance. Entire walls were carved with protective spells. Some of the most gentle were written in looping hieroglyphs. Your path is lit, return in peace. Your breath awaits you. The doors of morning open. Ceilings painted with stars were not decorative, they were maps, guiding the soul home as it drifted downward. A misplaced star could confuse the soul, so artists painted with extraordinary precision.
Some ceilings even represented the night sky of a specific season, matching the moment of the occupant's birth, so the soul recognized the heavens as familiar patterns. And then there were physical safeguards. Mirrors placed near the feet reflected harmful spirits back into the dark. Bronze mirrors were believed to hold a small flame of the sun within them, making them powerful guardians against wandering shadows. Near the head, amulets were arranged carefully, never randomly. The Eye of Horus protected the throat where the soul exited. The Jed pillar guarded the spine, believed to stabilize the soul's return descent. The Ankh symbol hovered near the hands, offering breath and life in case the soul struggled. Some households even kept jars of fragrant resin near the bed, believing the scent created a trail the soul could follow back into the body. And yet, even with these protections, the Egyptians recorded moments of terror. Souls delayed, souls confused, souls lost. One inscription describes a queen who woke from first sleep only to find her limbs heavy, her breath shallow, and her voice gone. Priests believed her soul had nearly failed to return. They wrote that she returned on the final thread of mourning. Another account speaks of a scribe who rose at dawn but behaved strangely, moving slowly, answering questions as if he were underwater. He regained himself by midday, and priests declared that his ba had returned weakened as from a long battle. Modern science would call these episodes sleep paralysis, REM intrusion, or post-seizure confusion. But to the Egyptians, they were evidence of a nightly war no one could see. Sleep, they believed, was not rest, it was survival, a journey the soul might not always complete. And so their nights were shaped by caution, reverence, and the constant awareness that dreams were not harmless, they were crossings.
As we reach the quietest depth of the night, imagine how the Egyptians felt knowing that every dream, every moment of drifting, was also a moment of vulnerability, a time when the soul stepped beyond the borders of the body and wandered into realms no living person could fully understand. To them, the soul was not an idea, it was a traveler. And like any traveler, it needed guidance, shelter, and a safe path home. That is why the Egyptians devoted so much of their spiritual energy to the architecture of sleep. To them, a bedroom was not just a room, it was a sanctuary, a threshold, a place where the invisible passed through the visible. That belief shaped the most intimate details of nightly life. The walls, for instance, were alive with meaning. Many chambers included comforting spells arranged in gentle spirals, designed to echo the drifting motion of the soul. Some read, "Follow the breath back to your vessel," or "Return to your name." Names mattered deeply. Egyptians believed that as long as a person's name was spoken or inscribed, the soul had a tether to the world of the living. That is why so many royal bedrooms included name spells carved above doorways to help the soul find the correct body at dawn. The ceilings, too, played their part. Artists painted stars with deliberate spacing, believing each star was a stepping stone for the soul. In certain tombs, some stars are arranged in a descending path toward the head of the sarcophagus, as though the soul were being visually guided downward into its resting place. Even in life, nobles mimic this pattern in their sleeping quarters. To sleep under a sky of carefully placed constellations was to sleep in alignment with the cosmos. And beneath that sky lay the sleeper, protected by amulets, oils, and the silence of loyal priests. The presence of priests around sleeping pharaohs reveals a profound truth. The Egyptians believed that the soul could be harmed not only by spirits, but also by confusion. A disoriented soul might enter the wrong chamber or the wrong body. This fear seems strange to modern listeners, but to the Egyptians, identity was fragile. A wandering Ba needed landmarks. That is why Pharaoh's sleeping chambers were often decorated with scenes of daily life, so the returning soul would recognize its world. A bed positioned incorrectly could confuse the soul. A shadow in the wrong place could mislead it. And so, entire rooms were built as navigational maps, both physical and spiritual. Despite all these precautions, history tells us that some souls still wandered too far. In one unsettling inscription, a high priest describes a man who awoke during the dangerous moment of dawn, but felt as though he returned as a stranger to his own flesh. He did not speak for 3 days. When he finally recovered, he said he had walked in fields with no horizon. Another text recounts the case of a court musician whose soul was believed to have returned fragmented. After a night of deep sleep, she awoke singing beautifully but speaking nonsense. Her voice, they said, had come back before her mind. These stories, viewed through a modern lens, resembled dissociation, neurological events, or parasomnias. But to the Egyptians, they were warnings. Gentle reminders that human consciousness was not fixed, but fluid, vulnerable, and deeply intertwined with realms beyond sight. And then there were the tragedies, the rare but terrifying accounts where the soul did not return at all. These individuals were not described as simply dead. They were described as empty, their bodies intact, but their essence gone. Priests performed rituals to call the soul back, chanting through the hours of dawn, but sometimes the silence stayed unbroken. Cases like these shaped Egyptian fear of sleep. They believed that every night carried a small risk, a risk that the journey outward might not end with a return. Yet this fear did not make them avoid sleep. Instead, it made them honor it, ritualize it, surround it with beauty, care, and vigilance. Sleep was the closest thing to death they experienced while alive, and they treated it with the same reverence. Tonight, as the story softens and your breath slows, perhaps you can sense a trace of that ancient understanding, the feeling that sleep is not falling away from life, but drifting towards something larger, deeper, quieter than waking.
Tonight, as we step further into the dim glow of ancient Egypt's midnight world, we arrive at one of its most unsettling truths. The cures people used to sleep often harmed them more than the insomnia itself. For the Egyptians, sleeplessness was not merely an inconvenience, it was a spiritual imbalance, a sign that the heart was troubled or that unseen forces brushed too closely against their dreams. And so they reached for remedies, plants, oils, incense, sacred brews, believing each mixture carried the quiet hand of the gods. But the night is full of shadows, and not all cures healed. In medical papyri, there are passages describing the drink of deep rest, a mixture made from poppy sap. It was meant to soften the mind, to slow the breath, to ease a restless heart.
But poppy sap is potent, far more than the healers understood. Some mixtures grew too strong. One text speaks of a woman who slept beyond the second dawn, her pulse fading like a wick burning low. Modern scholars now recognize this as an early account of opiate overdose. But to the Egyptians, it was simply a remedy that went too far, an offering that carried the sleeper too deeply into the realm of the gods. And yet, poppy was only one of the dangers. Mandrake root, with its curious human-shaped form, was believed to hold powerful nighttime magic. Some healers soaked it in wine, whispering prayers over the mixture. Others dried it into powder and stirred it into honey. But mandrake is deceptive, its soothing warmth hiding its toxicity. 12 deaths appear in surviving records, cases where those seeking sleep slipped suddenly into silence, their hearts stilled before their dreams could close. Physicians of the time wrote that these were souls carried too swiftly, as though the plant had opened a door the body was not ready to pass through. But the haunting stories are not about death itself. They are about what sleep remedies did to the mind. The sacred blue lotus, a symbol of rebirth and divine sight, was often brewed into tea to calm the nerves. Its scent was believed to lift the spirit toward serenity. Yet in stronger doses, it brought hallucinations so vivid that sleepers wandered from their beds, walked into the night, or spoke to invisible companions. One tale describes a nobleman who drank too much lotus brew and, believing he saw a celestial bird calling his name, climbed onto his roof in the darkness. He survived only because servants found him before he stepped off the edge. These moments to the Egyptians were warnings. When remedies blur the line between dream and waking, the soul becomes unanchored. The air itself could become dangerous. In many homes, people burned incense before sleep, myrrh, kifi, or cedar resin. When used lightly, these scents soothed the senses. But some combinations released heavy, intoxicating smoke, especially in enclosed rooms with low ceilings. Sleepers drifted deeper, slower, and sometimes did not rise again. A medical note carved on an ostracon reads, "Smoke overcame him while he sought peace." In modern terms, it was deadly inhalation. But in their worldview, it was the night taking someone back. And through all this, Egyptians continued experimenting with sleeping postures they believed were divine, positions said to align the body with cosmic energy. Some slept flat on stone surfaces, believing hardness kept the soul steady. Others positioned their necks at steep angles on wooden headrests to imitate the posture of sacred statues. But these attempts sometimes proved fatal. Chronic neck strain, inhibited breathing, and circulatory collapse appear in skeletons analyzed by modern archaeologists. Death in these cases came as quietly as sleep. As strange as it sounds, the Egyptians were not reckless. They were searching for calm, for silence, for dreams that carried meaning rather than fear. And in their search, they sometimes stepped too close to the edge of life itself. Tonight, as we move deeper into their world, remember this gentle truth. Even ancient people longed for rest, just as you do now. They reached into the night hoping to ease their minds, unaware that sometimes the night reached back.
As we drift further into the quiet shadows of ancient night, Imagine the Egyptians trying everything they knew, every plant, every scent, every whispered charm, to chase away the restlessness that kept them awake. Their world was loud with unseen forces. The Nile murmured beneath the moon. The desert wind scratched against mud brick walls. And the fear of sleeplessness, of lying awake too long, of letting one's soul wander too far, pressed heavily on their hearts. So they reached for cures, some gentle, some desperate, some dangerously misunderstood. One of the most troubling practices involved combining sleep remedies. Medical papyri describe mixtures that blended poppy, mandrake, and lotus into a single potion. Healers believed that if each ingredient brought a little calm, together they would bring perfect rest. But nature rarely bends to human intention. Some mixtures interacted violently inside the body. One papyrus recounts the fate of a middle-aged man who sought relief from chronic insomnia. His healer combined multiple herbs, stirred them into warm beer, and instructed him to drink before lying down. He did, and he never woke. The papyrus does not blame the healer. Instead, it blames the night that swallowed him too quickly, as though the darkness itself had taken him. What makes these stories so haunting is how tenderly they were written. Egyptians did not see these deaths as failures. They saw them as risks of approaching the sacred. To seek sleep was to step near the edge of the divine world, and sometimes that world reached back. Archaeologists have found clay jars coated inside with residues from ancient sleep mixtures. Through chemical analysis, researchers discovered traces of opiate alkaloids, mandrake toxins, and compounds from the blue lotus. In some jars, the concentration was so strong that modern scientists classify them as lethal doses. These jars were found beside beds, beneath headrests, or tucked behind shrines in private homes. Silent vessels holding the memory of nights when people longed for peace so deeply they risked everything to find it. But not all remedies were ingested. Some were breathed, some were worn, some were absorbed through the skin. Among the most surprising discoveries is the use of thick resin ointments rubbed onto the temples and chest. These ointments often contained mixtures of myrrh, pine resin, and ground nightshade. In small amounts, they soothed. In larger amounts, they slowed the heart. A medical note in the Ebers Papyrus mentions a man who applied such an ointment 3 nights in a row, each time increasing the amount when sleep did not come. On the 4th night, the healer wrote simply, "His breath thinned until it was no more." These ancient mistakes were never made out of cruelty or carelessness. They were born of longing for rest, for stillness, for a mind that would quiet long enough to dream. And the Egyptians truly believed that dreams were messages, dreams were visits, dreams were guidance. Missing them felt like losing a conversation with the gods. So they did everything to bring sleep closer. Yet the most dangerous experiments were not with plants or resins. They were with posture, with the belief that certain sleeping positions could attract divine protection. One dangerous practice involved arching the back over a carved stone block, so the chest lifted toward the sky. This posture, thought to imitate Osiris rising after death, was believed to restore life force. But sleeping in this position restricted breathing. Skeletal remains show signs of trauma associated with repeated chest compression. Some sleepers likely died quietly, their breath unable to deepen enough to sustain them. Another posture required lying fully prone with the head turned sharply to one side, mimicking sacred statues at certain temples. But this twisted position narrowed the airway. Combined with narcotic herbs, it became a silent trap. And still, people tried, because in their eyes, sleep was not a simple closing of the day. It was an act of alignment, of drawing the body back into harmony with the cosmos. Insomnia, therefore, was more than discomfort. It felt like disconnection, like drifting away from the order of Ma'at. In this way, every cure, every experiment, every whispered spell was an attempt to return to balance. And sometimes balance came, but sometimes it cost more than they expected.
As we move into the final, quiet stretch of this chapter, imagine an ancient world where sleeplessness was not simply discomfort, but a doorway, one that opened too wide, too easily into danger. The Egyptians believed that when a person could not sleep, their soul grew restless, pacing like a caged bird inside the ribs. And so they whispered, brewed, burned, mixed, and prayed, trying to soothe the spirit back into stillness. Yet in their longing for rest, they sometimes wandered into shadows that even the gods did not intend. One of the most tragic practices described in the medical papyri involves layering remedies across consecutive nights. If a potion didn't work on the first evening, the sleeper tried a stronger one the next night, and then a stronger one still. This escalation turned the search for rest into a quiet slide toward poisoning. A healer's record tells the story of a noblewoman who battled sleeplessness after the death of her child. On the first night, she drank lotus tea. On the second, lotus mixed with poppy. On the third, Mandrake powder was added to calm the trembling in her hands. Each remedy alone might have been safe. Combined, they overwhelmed her breath. She was found at dawn, lying peacefully but unresponsive, and her healer wrote with heartbreaking softness. Her dreams carried her farther than her feet could return. But the Egyptians also experimented with inhaled remedies, especially during times of grief or stress, believing that scent could calm the spirit more gently than drink. Priests prepared bowls of incense, kaifi, sandalwood, crushed petals and resins, and burned them beside the sleeper. The belief was simple. If the air was blessed, the mind would quiet, and sometimes it did. But in smaller rooms with no ventilation, the fragrant smoke became thick, heavy, and oxygen-starved. Modern researchers have measured the chemical residue from these burned mixtures and discovered compounds similar to modern sedatives, safe only in low concentrations. In high amounts, they caused dizziness, slow breathing, and in rare cases, silent suffocation. A priest's note from the temple of Dendera describes a case where the sleeper sank beneath the scented clouds and did not rise again. Some of the most dangerous responses to insomnia came not from fear, but from devotion. Egyptians believed that the gods communicated through dreams, and that dreams could guide a person's fate. Because of this, missing a dream due to sleeplessness felt catastrophic, like missing a message written specifically for your soul. In desperation, some individuals engaged in dream fasting, remaining awake for long hours, then consuming potent sleep mixtures in an attempt to force a vivid dream once exhaustion finally overcame them. But this sudden collapse into chemically deep sleep caused unpredictable reactions. One account describes a young priest who attempted dream fasting before a religious ceremony. He drank a strong brew intended to carry him directly into the dream realm. Instead, he fell motionless and pale. The record reads, "His body remained, but his voice did not return until the next moon." To modern eyes, it suggests a coma. To the Egyptians, it was a reminder that dreams were not doors one could force open. Perhaps the most haunting aspect of all these remedies is how familiar they feel, even across thousands of years. The Egyptians were not foolish, they were human. They wanted the same things people want tonight: peace of mind, rest, escape from worry. They turned to plants, to rituals, to the comfort of scent and posture, the same things we still reach for when sleep feels far away. And like us, they learned that the mind is delicate, that the balance between rest and harm is thin, that the night can heal, but it can also take. Archaeological evidence shows jars cracked from repeated use, amulets worn smooth by the warmth of anxious hands, and charcoal stains on walls where incense burned too long. These traces tell a story of people who sought relief so earnestly that they unknowingly stepped into danger. Sleep for them was not a passive act. It was a journey requiring guidance, protection, and humility. And when insomnia pushed them toward increasingly powerful remedies, they followed the path believing the gods would steady their steps. But sometimes the path curved into darkness. Tonight, as you listen and your breath softens, think of those ancient seekers, not as victims of superstition, but as companions across time. People who lay awake in the dark and hoped, as you do now, for rest. People who tried to calm the fluttering of their souls. People who wanted only to sleep without fear. And in the gentle hush of this moment, may you find what they searched for: a quiet mind, a steady heartbeat, and a night that welcomes you without demanding anything in return.
As we enter the vast, echoing world of Egypt's sacred temples, the night begins to change its shape. It grows quieter, slower, almost heavier, as though the air itself understands that we are stepping into one of the most secretive practices of the ancient world, the guardianship of sleep. Here, in chambers lit only by single flickering flames, lived the priests who guided dreams, protected wandering souls,
and watched over sleepers with a vigilance that bordered on devotion. They were known as the sleep guardians, and their lives moved to the rhythm of breath, silence, and the delicate balance between the mortal and the divine. The sleep guardians were not ordinary priests. They were chosen as children, selected with almost clinical scrutiny. Ancient texts describe the ideal candidates: a steady heartbeat, controlled breathing, a calm temperament, and a body capable of remaining motionless for hours without discomfort. Some scholars believe this was an early form of genetic screening, where family histories were quietly studied to find children who rarely fell ill, who slept deeply, who dreamed vividly. After selection, the long path began, a 10-year apprenticeship that unfolded like a slow, disciplined meditation. Their training did not begin with rituals or magic. It began with the body. Young apprentices were taught to slow their pulse, to regulate their breath until it matched the cadence of temple drums, to remain awake in stillness and asleep in clarity. They learned to enter light dream states on command, a skill required to travel alongside the soul of a sleeper without being pulled into their dreams or losing their own consciousness. Senior guardians described this as walking the edge of the river, feeling the current without stepping in. Only after mastering body and breath did they begin studying dreams. For the Egyptians, dreams were not random shapes of the mind. They were messages, maps, warnings, and sometimes doors. Apprentices studied thousands of dream records carved on temple walls or recorded on fragile papyri. They memorized symbols, birds, boats, broken jars, rising suns, and learned how each image changed meaning depending on the dreamer's spiritual condition. But this knowledge, though vast, was only the surface. The deeper teachings were revealed only to those who proved they could withstand the mental strain. Senior sleep guardians taught apprentices how to sense disruptions in a sleeper's dream path, how to recognize when a soul drifted too far from its body, and how to anchor it through whispered incantations timed with the sleeper's breathing. Only a handful graduated into full guardianship. Those who did gained access to the temple's most restricted spaces, rooms built specifically for divine sleep. These chambers were small, silent, and meticulously designed to guide the soul safely. Some were lined with soft limestone that amplified breath like a low, steady hum. Others were covered with star-painted ceilings that mirrored the sky exactly at the hour of the sleeper's birth. The rooms smelled of cedar and lotus, creating an atmosphere meant to cradle the mind. Before any temple sleep ritual, the guardians performed purification rites lasting more than 3 hours. They washed in cold water drawn before sunrise, burned herbs that cleanse the air, and stood barefoot on cool stone floors to ground their bodies. Their silence was absolute, not a whisper, not a shuffle, not a murmur. They believed any disturbance, any ripple in the stillness could interfere with the soul's ability to rise and return safely. Only when the chamber felt as calm as a resting lake did they lead the sleeper in. The guardian's task was not merely to watch. They listened to breath, to shifts in the air, to the subtle trembling of dreams. They sat at the borders of consciousness, monitoring the invisible journey taking place within the sleeper's mind.
and they bore the weight of immense responsibility. It was said that a single failure, a soul lost, a dream shattered, a breath misjudged, could mean death. And for that, the punishment was unforgiving. Some temples imposed exile. The most sacred ones imposed death, not as cruelty, but as acknowledgement that sleep was sacred, and those entrusted with it carried the fate of worlds within their silence.
As we move deeper into the hidden routines of the sleep guardians, the temple begins to feel less like a structure of stone and more like a living organism, breathing, pulsing, waiting. Every corridor feels intentional. Every chamber seems aligned with something ancient and unseen. And at the heart of it all were the men who had given their entire lives to navigating the fragile pathways of dreams. Among the guardians, hierarchy was everything. Junior sleep apprentices lived in small, bare chambers carved into the outer walls of the temple. Their days were long, filled with physical conditioning and dream observation exercises. They were responsible for maintaining silence, tending the temple lamps, and learning to read the subtle changes in a sleeper's posture or breath. They sat for hours beside elders, eyes half-lidded, absorbing the quiet rhythms of the work like students listening to the tide. But they were not yet permitted inside the inner sanctum. That space was reserved for the senior sleep guardians, the ones who had mastered the slow art of protecting the soul. These senior priests moved with a kind of weightless calm, their footsteps barely touching the ground. Their training had reshaped them entirely. Their pulses were slow, their breaths soft, their faces serene even under pressure. Records describe them as men who walked in two worlds, living half in wakefulness, half in the realm where dreams were interpreted and guided. They carried within them a quiet authority, earned not by rank alone, but by years of witnessing the delicate boundary between life and whatever lies beyond sleep. The transition from apprentice to guardian required a ritual known as the listening night. On this night, a candidate sat alone in the dreaming chamber, surrounded by star symbols carved into the walls. No candles were lit. Only the moonlight guided the space. The apprentice had to remain awake, yet profoundly still for the entire night, listening, not to sounds, but to the subtle shifts of their own mind. Elders believed that if a novice could hear the soft footsteps of their soul without fear or distraction, then they were ready. If they failed, if they panicked or drifted into sleep or lost focus, they were dismissed from the path entirely. Many never returned. For those who succeeded, the world changed overnight. They were granted access to chambers forbidden to all others, rooms where dream experiments took place, where sleep was studied as carefully as astronomy or medicine. Some chambers contained beds carved from alabaster, believed to hold moonlight in their surface. Others contained polished bronze mirrors positioned to reflect the sleeper's face during specific hours of the night.
The guardians believed the mirrors acted as silent watchers, ensuring that if the soul wandered too far, it would be drawn back by the image of its earthly vessel. These chambers also held sealed boxes carved with protective hieroglyphs. Inside were relics used only in the most dangerous dream rituals. Amulets shaped like open eyes, necklaces of lapis lazuli carved with symbols of return, and small stone tablets inscribed with secret passages from the Book of Dreams. These objects were considered powerful anchors, each one used sparingly, each handled with a reverence matched only by priests who tended the bodies of pharaohs. The guardians' days were structured with meticulous care. Before sunset, they reviewed dream records and prepared purification tools. At twilight, they performed silent meditations to synchronize their breath with that of the sleepers they would guard. And through the darkest hours of the night, they sat vigil, following the faint rise and fall of the chest, the twitch of fingers, the whisper of a dream crossing in or out of a soul. Their patience was legendary. It was said that a guardian could detect the instant a dream shifted from harmless wandering into spiritual danger. Yet within this calm discipline lay a truth rarely spoken aloud. The guardians carried a burden deeper than any other role in temple life. Their work involved witnessing fear, confusion, longing, everything the human mind released when the body sank into vulnerability. They saw visions that terrified sleepers, felt the tension of souls slipping too far from their flesh, and heard whispers spoken in forgotten languages. Senior priests wrote that this proximity to the dream realm could shake even the strongest minds. Some apprentices left the order not because they failed their training, but because they feared what they saw lingering behind the dreams of others. Still, those who stayed believed the risk was sacred. They believed that guiding another person's sleep was the closest anyone could come to touching the divine without crossing the threshold of death. And in the silent spaces between breaths, they found a strange serenity, a peace found only by those who watched over the most fragile hours of the human spirit.
As night deepens around the temple, the role of the sleep guardians becomes even more mysterious and far more dangerous. For in these final hours before dawn, when the human soul was believed to drift farthest from the body, the guardians assumed their most demanding duties. They watched the rise and fall of the chest with unwavering attention, their bodies utterly still, their minds sharpened into a state that was neither wakefulness nor sleep. It was during these hours that they encountered the most profound secrets of their order, secrets whispered only to those who had proven absolute loyalty. Many of these secrets came from what the priests called controlled dream states. This was a technique passed down silently, without written record, from master to master. A guardian would enter a trance-like state, hovering at the threshold of dreaming while remaining aware of the sleeper's breath. In this state, some claimed they could sense not just the dreamer's emotional shifts, but the symbolic disturbances within the dream itself. The flicker of a torch that shouldn't be there, the sudden appearance of water in a dream where sand once dominated, the subtle trembling that meant the soul was struggling to return. Senior priests taught that these signs were warnings, the dream realm's way of signaling that something had gone wrong. The
the guardians treated them with utmost seriousness. Through these controlled states, guardians also gained access to knowledge that was forbidden outside their order. Some wrote, in coded fragments, about being able to see echoes of memories that were not their own. Others described hearing words spoken by ancestors long dead, or seeing brief flashes of events that had not yet occurred. This knowledge was guarded fiercely. To reveal it to anyone beyond the order, whether commoner, noble, or even a pharaoh, was considered an unforgivable betrayal. Ancient laws stated clearly, the dream paths are sacred. To speak them aloud is to unravel the threads of the soul. And those who violated this rule faced the harshest consequences. Punishment was not theoretical. Records exist, faded, fragmented, but unmistakable, of guardians executed for failing in their duties. The most infamous case describes a senior priest in Thebes who misjudged the dream state of a noble and allowed the sleeper to drift too far into the spiritual realm. The noble never awakened. The priest was dragged to the courtyard at dawn, where judgment was carried out swiftly. To the modern world, this seems brutal, but within the logic of the temple, the priest had let a soul slip beyond the point of return. His death was viewed not as vengeance, but as a grim rebalancing of spiritual order. But punishment was not reserved solely for failures. It was also imposed on those who misused their knowledge. One guardian was put to death after attempting to manipulate the dreams of a political rival. Another was executed for revealing secret dream interpretations to a royal concubine. The temple believed that dreams could influence decisions, shape destinies, or sway the mind toward choices it might not otherwise make. To tamper with that power was to tamper with the divine order. Despite this danger, the guardians continued their work with a serenity that seems almost impossible to imagine. They believed deeply in the purpose of their calling, protecting the most vulnerable hours of human existence. And perhaps it was this devotion that kept them steady, even as they walked nightly along the edge of life and death. As dawn approached, they guided the returning souls with soft whispers and rhythmic breathing, helping them cross the fragile threshold into their bodies. When the sleepers finally awoke, they often remembered nothing of the night's battles, unaware of how close they had come to drifting beyond reach. But the guardians remembered, and in the dim light of early morning, they bowed their heads, not in exhaustion, but in quiet gratitude that another night had passed safely. For these priests lived with a truth very few people ever confronted. Sleep is never just rest. It is a journey, a danger, a threshold, and someone must guard it. Someone must listen. Someone must keep watch in the silence between the heartbeats of the world. And so, night after night, the sleep guardians surrendered their own dreams so others could keep theirs.
As we drift into the realm of dreams, a place the Egyptians believed was more real than waking life, the temple walls around us seemed to dissolve, leaving only faint torchlight flickering like distant memories. For to the ancient Egyptians, dreams were not soft and harmless. They were prophetic currents, powerful enough to shape kingdoms, alter destinies, and in some cases bring ruin to those who misunderstood them. This chapter, known among scholars as the Curse of Dreams, unveils a world where every dream was watched, recorded, judged, and feared. The Egyptians kept dream registries that stretched across more than 5 centuries,
These were not random notes, but meticulous records carved into papyri and stone tablets, each one describing a dream, its symbols, the dreamer's emotional state, and the priest's interpretation. Some temples dedicated entire rooms to these registries, their walls lined with shelves of tightly rolled scrolls bound by cord. At night, apprentices would walk these rooms by oil lamp, studying the countless dreams of people long dead, comparing symbols that reappeared across generations. The belief was simple. If the same dream returned again and again through history, it was not coincidence, it was a warning. But the warnings were dangerous. A false interpretation could destroy a life. Ancient law stated that if a priest misread a prophetic dream and caused harm through his mistake, he could be imprisoned or executed. There is a fragmented record describing the fate of a priest in Memphis who predicted prosperity for a noble family after interpreting a dream of rising birds. Months later, famine struck the region. The family accused him of misguiding the gods. He was taken at dawn, and the record ends with only one haunting line: he dreamt no more. Even the Pharaohs' dreams were treated with caution. Every week, the highest-ranking dream priests gathered in a private chamber to review the Pharaoh's dreams. These sessions could last hours as priests debated symbols, whether a drifting lotus meant peace or danger, whether a crumbling wall was a sign of rebellion or personal weakness. The Pharaoh himself did not speak during these sessions. He simply listened, absorbing the interpretations like a man standing at the edge of multiple possible futures. Some pharaohs took these dreams so seriously that they delayed military campaigns, changed political alliances, or abandoned construction projects solely on what they saw at night. The temples also enforced strict dream-sharing protocols. Certain types of dreams had to be reported immediately. Dreams involving fire, collapsing structures, dead relatives returning with messages, or gods appearing in unrecognizable forms. These dreams were considered volatile, like sparks that could ignite misfortune if left unspoken. Ordinary citizens, nobles, soldiers, even children were expected to report these dreams to local priests, who would then decide whether the dream required intervention. But perhaps the most extraordinary of all were the collective dreaming experiments. Some temples believed that if many people slept in synchronized cycles, their dreams could merge into a single river of prophecy. On rare nights, often during eclipses or significant celestial alignments, entire temple staffs would lie down together in vast halls, their heads pointing toward the same direction, their breathing slowly unifying. Senior priests walked among them with incense bowls, murmuring instructions about letting the mind drift toward shared symbols. There are faint records suggesting that in these collective dreams, multiple sleepers saw the same images: a burning horizon, a river running backward, a golden hawk landing upon a broken crown. Whether coincidence or something deeper, the Egyptians took it seriously. Nightmares were the most feared dreams of all. If someone screamed or thrashed during a night ritual, emergency dream watchers rushed to their side. These priests entered trance states, attempting to intercept the nightmare before it overwhelmed the dreamer. Some described the process as reaching into a storm. Others wrote that nightmares left a residue in the room, an emotional thickness that lingered like smoke. Sleeper and priest alike often woke shaking. Modern sleep studies, surprisingly, validate many of these ancient observations. The Egyptians knew that REM sleep was the stage where dreams were vivid, symbolic, and sometimes terrifying. They recognized patterns of shared symbolism in people undergoing similar stress, and they sensed that nightmares had physiological effects. Without the language of neuroscience, they nevertheless mapped the terrain of sleep with astonishing accuracy. To the Egyptians, dreams were gifts, but also burdens. They could open doors or close them, bless or curse, illuminate or destroy. And the deeper we drift into their dreaming world, the clearer it becomes that sleep was not merely rest. It was a landscape where the human mind stood face to face with destiny.
As we drift further into the heart of Egypt's dream traditions, the night around us begins to feel charged with an almost electric stillness. The air in these temples seems to hold its breath, as though aware that we are stepping into territory where dreams were not only interpreted, but governed, regulated, and sometimes feared like living beings. For the Egyptians believed that dreams had intentions, desires, and tempers of their own. At the center of this belief stood the dream priests, keepers of the great prophetic registries. These scrolls recorded not just the dreams themselves, but patterns that emerged over decades, even centuries. Some registries focused on agricultural dreams, tracking symbols that predicted flooding or drought. Others were devoted entirely to warfare, maintaining lists of dream omens that historically preceded invasions. But the most secretive registry of all was the Book of the Cursed Dreams, a tightly guarded collection of symbols considered so volatile that only the senior priests were permitted to read them. These were dreams believed to foretell bloodshed, rebellion, or the fall of rulers. Even the pharaohs were not allowed to view them directly. They only received soft-spoken summaries that avoided vivid details, as though the images themselves were too dangerous to utter aloud. The fear of false prophecy lingered like a shadow over every dream interpretation. Priests worked under a weight few modern minds can imagine. If they misread a dream, causing a pharaoh to act too soon or too late, the punishment could be immediate and severe. Some temples placed misinterpreting priests into solitary meditation chambers for years. Others exiled them into the desert, where the silence stretched too wide for most minds to bear. A rare few were executed, not as cruelty, but as a way of silencing the corrupted dream path according to temple law. It was a world where sleep was sacred, and so was the truth. The pharaoh's weekly dream review was one of the most solemn rituals in temple life. The pharaoh entered the chamber barefoot, symbolizing vulnerability, and sat upon a low alabaster seat while priests surrounded him in a circle. He would speak his dreams slowly, sometimes struggling to recall fragments, an image of a serpent coiling around a pillar or a river glowing under moonlight. Each symbol carried layered meanings that depended on his age, his health, the state of the nation, and even the season. The priests debated with hushed intensity. If they sensed danger, their voices softened further, as though afraid that speaking the omen too harshly might make it manifest. But the governance of dreams extended far beyond the royal court. Ordinary Egyptians participated in the dream reporting system for generations. If a farmer dreamt of his fields catching fire, he was required to report it to the village priest by sunrise. If a soldier dreamt of drowning, he had to inform his commander, who then informed higher priests. Dreams involving animals acting against their nature, lions speaking, crocodiles walking upright, were treated with particular seriousness. These dreams were believed to signal disruptions in Ma'at, the cosmic order that held the universe together. In the higher temples, dream priests often cross-reference these reports to identify emerging patterns. A drought dream in one region, combined with a dream of dying livestock in another, might be flagged as a national warning. Sometimes these combined patterns matched celestial events, the rising of Sirius, an eclipse, or an unexpected alignment of Orion's belt. To the Egyptians, dreams were threads woven into the fabric of the cosmos. They read them like astronomers studying the stars. Then there were the collective dreaming rituals, quiet experiments conducted behind sealed stone doors. Dozens of participants lay in rows, each aligned with the Earth's magnetic direction, their hands resting lightly on their chest. A senior priest walked among them, lightly tapping specific pressure points on the wrists to slow heart rate and synchronize breathing. The goal was not sleep, but harmony. If enough participants drifted into the same stage of dreaming at the same moment, the priests believed their dreams could merge, forming a clearer prophetic picture. Records suggest that during one such synchronized ritual, 60 sleepers reported seeing identical imagery: a falcon rising from blackened fields carrying a broken branch. Months later, crop blight ravaged the region. Coincidence, perhaps, but to the Egyptians, it was confirmation that dreams were windows into the future. Nightmares, however, were treated as disruptions of the soul. When someone in the temple dream hall screamed, priests rushed forward with bowls of cool water and incense, whispering chants to calm the spirit. Nightmare interventions required immense skill. The priests attempted to guide the dream back into safety by manipulating breath rhythms and gentle touches. Some described nightmares as storms in the mind, and the priest's role as that of a navigator steering a boat through invisible waves. To modern researchers, these rituals resemble what we now call REM sleep interventions, lucid dream prompts, and trauma nightmare treatments. It is astonishing how intuitively the Egyptians understood sleep cycles thousands of years before science named them. To them, dreams were not illusions, they were revelations, and revelations once spoken out loud carried weight. They could become destiny.
As we enter the final stretch of this chapter, the dream world of ancient Egypt begins to feel less like a distant curiosity and more like a breathing landscape, one shaped by fear, hope, and the unspoken understanding that dreams carried a power no one could fully control. For the Egyptians, the question was never whether dreams mattered, it was how to survive them. This fear became clearest during the temple's emergency dream-watching deployments. These were rare, but when they occurred, the entire temple seemed to shift into a different rhythm. If multiple nightmare reports appeared in the same night, from villagers, soldiers, or even apprentices, the priests interpreted this as a disturbance in the spiritual realm. They moved quickly, gathering in the dream court,
a circular chamber lit by a single flame that burned blue when mixed with sacred oils. Here the priests entered trance states, their breathing synchronized, their voices murmuring soft incantations. The purpose was not to repel nightmares one by one, but to sense whether a larger force was moving beneath them, a ripple in the dream world that could swell into danger. There is a scroll from Karnak describing one such night. It says that 3 children from different districts awoke screaming with the same dream. A giant serpent coiled around the sun, squeezing until it dimmed. Priests interpreted this as a cosmic imbalance, a sign that something in the kingdom's spiritual harmony had shifted. Rituals were performed throughout the night, incense burnings, protective chants, even offerings placed beside the temple's sacred pools. The children eventually returned to normal sleep and nothing catastrophic happened. But the priests took note. Dreams, especially shared ones, were not accidents. These shared dreams fascinated the Egyptians and in some ways frightened them. They understood that when many people dreamt the same symbol, it revealed something collective, fear spreading silently, or destiny whispering to an entire population at once. Senior priests often said, "A dream shared is a truth uncovered," but truths could be dangerous. Prophetic accuracy brought great respect, but prophetic error brought ruin. Even commoners felt this burden. A merchant who dreamed of his house collapsing might face suspicion from neighbors who feared he had been visited by a curse. A soldier who dreamed of abandoning a battle might be accused of weakness or treason. Sometimes people whispered their dreams only to their spouses, afraid that speaking them out loud would pull misfortune closer. And yet, in the midst of this fear, the Egyptians held a quiet reverence for dreams. They believed dreams allowed the soul to wander freely, touching realms that waking life could never reach. They believed dreams connected the living to the dead, parents speaking to children, ancestors offering guidance, lovers separated by death meeting under starlit skies. In their eyes, dreams were not intrusions, they were bridges. Modern science has only recently begun to validate pieces of this worldview. REM sleep research shows that in deep dream states, the brain processes trauma, fear, memory, and emotional imbalance. Studies show that people under shared stress sometimes develop identical dream patterns, and nightmares, especially recurring ones, often signal internal conflicts or unresolved danger. The Egyptians sensed these patterns thousands of years before any laboratory existed. Without wires or monitors, they recognized that the mind reveals its secrets only at night. In the quiet hours before sunrise, when dream priests finished their work and dismissed the sleepers, the temple would fall into a profound calm. The stone walls no longer felt heavy. The air no longer trembled with unseen tension. It was as if the dreams themselves had settled back into silence, returning to whatever realm they came from. The priests would then walk out into the courtyard, watching the first light touch the tops of the pylons. Some bowed their heads in gratitude. Others simply closed their eyes, relieved the night had passed without disaster. And though their responsibilities were heavy, they carried them with dignity, knowing that guarding the dreams of a civilization was a task no one else could bear. For to the Egyptians, dreams were not illusions, they were echoes of truth, shadows of destiny, and whispers from realms beyond human understanding. And in those whispers lay the curse and the beauty of dreaming.
As we move into the darker hours of the night, the hours when even the most disciplined dream priests felt the weight of silence pressing against the temple walls, we begin to understand why the Egyptians believed sleep was never entirely safe. To them, the line between sleep and death was a fragile thread, one that could snap without warning. And so, in addition to dream priests and guardians of the soul, there existed another group whose duties unfolded quietly in the shadows, the night guards. These guards were unlike soldiers who defended borders or patrolled city streets. Their work required a different kind of vigilance, one shaped not by violence, but by an understanding of how easily a sleeping body could be pulled into danger. They did not watch the horizon, they watched the breath. They did not listen for marching armies, they listened for the sound of something small, something subtle, something that might brush against stone or flicker at the edge of darkness. Their presence was not meant to intimidate, but to shield the sleeper from threats both physical and spiritual. Guard rotations followed a strict 4-hour cycle. The Egyptians believed that after 4 hours of wakefulness, the mind began to dull and the senses lost their sharpness. And in a place where one faint mistake could cost a life, dullness was unacceptable. So the guards moved like clockwork. One pair approached the chamber entrance while the other withdrew, stepping past each other with the quiet precision of dancers. The changeover had no spoken words, only a small shift of posture, a nod, the passing of a torch whose flame was kept intentionally dim so shadows would not leap unexpectedly across the walls. Every movement was slow, deliberate, meant to preserve the calm of the sleeper. The guards carried weapons, but not the kind one might imagine. Swords and spears were forbidden inside sacred sleep chambers, as they were believed to disturb spiritual equilibrium. Instead, guards bore curved daggers crafted from wood, bone, or bronze, materials chosen for their silence rather than their strength. These were not weapons for combat, they were tools for precision. The dagger was used to gently lift a serpent from the stone floor, to clear away scorpions hiding in cracks, or to cut cloth if a sleeper's garment tangled in a dangerous way. Metal armor was forbidden. Instead, guards wore soft linen wraps that muted every rustle. Their only metal accessory was a small ring carved with protective symbols, believed to repel malicious spirits wandering through the corridors at night. To communicate, the guards used a silent signaling system developed over centuries. A raised palm meant hold your position, a tapped foot meant danger near the ground. A slow exhale through the nose signaled approach carefully. And when a real emergency arose, they used the most startling signal of all, complete stillness. A guard would freeze entirely, becoming like a statue in the moonlight. This was the alarm. The other guard, seeing the stillness, would immediately begin scanning the dark, knowing that the frozen posture meant danger was present but invisible. Perhaps an animal, perhaps a person, perhaps something the Egyptians had no words for.
The threats they faced were not imaginary. Snakes often slipped into the cooler chambers during the night, drawn to the steady warmth of human bodies. Spiders the size of a small cup lived in temple crevices, descending silently when disturbed. Thieves occasionally attempted to enter the temple not to steal gold, but to steal dreams, seeking prophetic knowledge or divine permission for their crimes. And then there were the dangers no one fully understood, the sudden tremors in a sleeper's chest that signaled the beginning of sleep-death, or the unexplained temperature shifts that priests interpreted as spirits passing nearby. Archaeological evidence confirms much of this world. Excavations at Thebes and Abydos uncovered guard stations built directly into the outer walls of sleep temples. These small rooms held remnants of oil lamps, water bowls, linen wraps, and curved daggers with handles worn smooth by decades of touch. Some stations even contained markings on the stone floor, tiny grooves where guards repeatedly paced in silent patterns to stay alert without disturbing the sanctity of the chamber. The guards thus stood between sleepers and the forces that moved through the darkness. Their duty was not glorious nor honored with ceremony, but in a civilization that believed the soul wandered dangerously far from the body during sleep, these guards were considered as vital as the priests themselves. For it was their watchful stillness, hour after hour, that kept sleep from drifting too close to death.
As the hours slipped deeper into the night, the guards' work became more delicate, almost ritualistic. In the stillness surrounding a sleeping body, even the faintest disturbance held meaning. A shifting breeze that wasn't supposed to exist. A soft rustle along a wall that hadn't sounded in hours. A sudden tightening of the sleeper's fingers. The guards learned to read these signs the way astronomers read stars, tracing patterns of danger long before the danger itself fully appeared. Their training was severe. Before becoming full night guards, recruits spent years in mock chambers designed to test their instincts. They were placed in total darkness, with only the sound of their own breath for company. In that darkness, trainers introduced subtle threats. A pebble rolling across the floor. The faint movement of a rope meant to mimic a snake. A shift in temperature, signaling something spirit-like, at least by temple logic. The purpose was not to frighten them. It was to sharpen their awareness until the night became as readable as a scroll. One recorded training incident tells the story of a young guard who sensed danger before any sound had been made. Standing outside a sacred sleep chamber, he felt what he later described as the air pulling in the wrong direction. When he entered, he found a serpent coiled beneath the sleeper's bedding, preparing to strike. His dagger, carved from dark acacia wood, moved silently. The snake was removed without waking the sleeper or disturbing the dream priests. That young guard later became captain of the night watch. But not all stories ended well. Some training incidents were preserved as cautionary tales. One describes a guard who failed to recognize the meaning of a sleeper's changing breath. He assumed it was simply a dream turning restless. By the time the priests intervened,
the sleeper was slipping into what the Egyptians called sleep death, a sudden, unnatural stopping of breath, believed to be caused by the soul losing its path home. The guard was not punished, but he withdrew from service, spending the rest of his life as a groundskeeper, never again stepping near a sleep chamber. Real threats, however, extended far beyond animals or breathless moments. The greatest danger was human. Robbers, desperate or reckless, sometimes attempted to break into sacred temples not to steal treasure, but to harm sleepers themselves. It was believed that damaging someone during sleep could sever the connection between soul and body, trapping the soul in a wandering state. Some criminals sought to weaponize this belief, while others simply hoped to steal prophetic dreams by inhaling the incense used in rituals. Night guards had to confront these intruders silently and swiftly, often restraining them with cloth binds rather than weapons, since noise was forbidden. There were rarer, stranger incidents, stories that still haunt Egyptologists today. At Abydos, a tablet describes a moment when both guards outside a sleep chamber froze simultaneously, their stillness signaling danger. Inside, the priests reported that the temperature dropped so suddenly that frost formed on the sleeper's eyelashes. No animal or human intruder was found, but when the sleeper awoke, he claimed that someone was calling him from a corridor of stars. The priests took the event seriously, adding it to the list of documented supernatural threats. Artifacts found in guard stations give weight to these stories. Excavations revealed fragments of linen wraps reinforced with soot to make them easier to grip in darkness. Small bowls filled with hardened resin, believed to mask human scent, sat beside curved bronze daggers. At one site, archaeologists discovered stones arranged in deliberate patterns, as though marking the silent routes guards took each night. These findings suggest that guarding sleepers was not improvisation. It was a carefully crafted discipline. Despite the intensity of their work, the guards were taught to carry themselves with calmness. Any hint of panic could ripple into the chamber, disturbing the sleeper's fragile connection to their dreaming world. So the guards learned a quiet form of courage, one that did not shout or clash metal, but instead breathed slowly, steadily, in harmony with the rhythm of the sleeping body they protected. And through the long hours of the night, they remained the unseen protectors, walking the border between life and death, ensuring that the sleeper could drift safely into dreams and return again with the coming dawn.
As dawn crept closer, a thin blue whisper stretching across the sky, the guards entered the final and most dangerous phase of their watch. The Egyptians believed the moments just before sunrise were when the soul was most vulnerable, caught halfway between the dreaming world and the waking one. It was during this transition that the soul, weary from its journey through the night,
could lose its direction and wander too far into realms it wasn't meant to enter. And so the guards became even more alert, their senses sharpened not by fear, but by the strange tenderness of knowing the sleeper was closest to the edge. The chamber during these hours looked almost unreal. The oil lamp burned at its lowest flame, its light trembling like a hesitant heartbeat. The air turned cooler, carrying a faint smell of stone that always deepened before the first warmth of sunrise. Sometimes, a sleeper's breath would shift into a lighter, fragile rhythm, as if their soul was pausing at the threshold, deciding whether to step back into the body or drift just a little longer in the world of dreams. Whenever this happened, the guards would instinctively lean forward, not touching the sleeper, but anchoring the room with their presence. There were ancient protocols for this moment. If the sleeper stirred but did not fully wake, the nearest guard would move a single step closer, positioning himself between the sleeper and the chamber door, the symbolic boundary between life and the afterworld. If the sleeper whispered unknowable words, as some did while trapped between states, the guard would breathe slowly, as if lending his rhythm to the drifting soul. And if the sleeper suddenly froze, breath pausing in the air, the guard was trained to strike a piece of smooth stone behind his back, a soft, controlled click that called the priests without startling the sleeper. This sound was believed to remind the soul of its path home. Historical records describe numerous dawn emergencies. One scroll from Saqqara details the case of a noblewoman whose breath halted 3 times in a single night. The guards saw her mouth open slightly, as though she was calling out to someone who stood far away. Priests were summoned. They sang a low chant, barely louder than wind against reeds, urging her soul to return. At the 3rd pause, her breath caught again, and the guards leaned forward so intently that later they could recount the exact moment the air re-entered her chest. She survived, and later credited the guards' unwavering stillness for her return. Other cases were more haunting. At Karnak, a record describes a sleeper who woke suddenly at dawn, eyes wide, claiming he had walked past his own body and seen the guards waving at him across a river made of white sand. The priests insisted this was a symbolic vision, a warning about the thin border between dreaming and death. The guards in that case remained silent in their report, but their written marks, tight, straight strokes carved into wood, hinted at tension they never verbally admitted. Archaeology supports these rituals with quiet evidence. Some dawn-specific objects were found buried beneath guard stations, small mirrors angled upward to catch the first beam of sunlight, believed to guide wandering souls, bowls of water placed at entrances to cool the breath as sleepers transitioned back into waking life, and stones smoothed over centuries by the tapping signal that summoned priests in emergencies. These objects reveal a world where even the first ray of light carried spiritual weight. Despite all these dangers, the guards approached dawn not with dread, but with a sense of sacred duty. They believed that by guiding sleepers into morning, they played a role in something larger than themselves, helping bridge the personal world of an individual dreamer with the cosmic rhythms of the rising sun. In those final minutes, when darkness began to fold back and the walls of the chamber turned from shadow to gray, the guards stood unwavering, like pillars carved from the silence itself. And when the sleeper finally opened their eyes, sometimes slowly, sometimes with a small gasp. The guards stepped back into the shadows, their task complete. They left no words, no explanations. Only the faint marks of their footsteps told the story of how they had stood between the world of sleep and the world of the living, ensuring that another life safely crossed the fragile border at dawn.
As we drift into the final stretch of the night, there is a truth the ancient Egyptians guarded more fiercely than any spell, any amulet, any ritual carved into the stone walls of their temples. It is the secret that lay beneath everything: their sleep customs, their dream practices, their rituals of protection. To them, sleep was never merely rest. It was rehearsal, a quiet imitation of death, a small, safe descent into the unknown, taken night after night, so the great journey at the end of life would not feel so foreign. And it was this belief, this merging of sleep and death, that shaped the final and most mysterious layer of their nightly rituals. For centuries, this connection remained hidden, not because it was deliberately erased, but because modern scholars never knew where to look. The Egyptians spoke in metaphors, layered like the limestone blocks of their tombs. When they wrote that sleep was the soft crossing, they did not mean it poetically. They meant it literally. When they said a sleeper walked the western path, they were describing a state between life and the afterworld. And when the Pharaohs spoke of mastering immortality, they meant that they learned to navigate death the same way they navigated their dreams, slowly, with practice, with familiarity earned through thousands of nights. This truth began to unfold only recently. In early 2023, archaeologists uncovered a set of hidden chambers beneath a lesser-known temple near Abydos. These chambers, narrow and steep, led not to burial rooms, but to small, windowless cells lined with polished stone. Their surfaces bore carvings unlike any found in tombs, spirals representing breath, long curves symbolizing the descent into sleep, and repeated patterns that seemed to mimic the ebb and flow of consciousness. One carving showed a figure lying on a raised platform, surrounded by priests, while lines radiated from the sleeper's chest like waves. Scholars realized they were not looking at depictions of death rituals. They were looking at depictions of sleep rituals designed to prepare for them. These secret rooms were used for what the Egyptians called the second crossing, a practice reserved only for high priests and pharaohs. A person would lie on the stone platform for hours, guided through controlled breathing and chanting, intended to mimic the transitional sensations of dying, slowing heart rate, dimming awareness, drifting thought. The goal was not to induce fear, but the opposite, to make the unknown familiar, to make death feel like returning to a place the soul already knew. And it was this belief, this merging of sleep and death, that shaped the final and most mysterious layer of their nightly rituals. For centuries, this connection remained hidden, not because it was deliberately erased, but because modern scholars never knew where to look. The Egyptians spoke in metaphors, layered like the limestone blocks of their tombs.
When they wrote that sleep was the soft crossing, they did not mean it poetically. They meant it literally. When they said a sleeper walked the western path, they were describing a state between life and the afterworld. And when the Pharaohs spoke of mastering immortality, they meant that they learned to navigate death the same way they navigated their dreams, slowly, with practice, with familiarity earned through thousands of nights. This truth began to unfold only recently. In early 2023, archaeologists uncovered a set of hidden chambers beneath a lesser-known temple near Abydos. These chambers, narrow and steep, led not to burial rooms, but to small, windowless cells lined with polished stone. Their surfaces bore carvings unlike any found in tombs, spirals representing breath, long curves symbolizing the descent into sleep, and repeated patterns that seemed to mimic the ebb and flow of consciousness. One carving showed a figure lying on a raised platform surrounded by priests, while lines radiated from the sleeper's chest like waves. Scholars realized they were not looking at depictions of death rituals. They were looking at depictions of sleep rituals designed to prepare for them. These secret rooms were used for what the Egyptians called the second crossing, a practice reserved only for high priests and pharaohs. A person would lie on the stone platform for hours, guided through controlled breathing and chanting, intended to mimic the transitional sensations of dying, slowing heart rate, dimming awareness, drifting thought. The goal was not to induce fear, but the opposite, to make the unknown familiar, to make death feel like returning to a place the soul already knew. And this was the final secret of Egyptian sleep. They treated every night like a small piece of the afterlife, every dream like a message from the threshold, every awakening like a return to the world of the living. And once you understand this, so many mysteries suddenly make sense. The protective spells carved into ceilings, the positioning of incense bowls, the hours chosen for sleeping, the rituals guarding the dawn. They weren't merely superstitions, they were part of a system, a structured spiritual training designed to help each person slip gently into death when their time came, without terror, without confusion, without losing their way. Modern science, oddly enough, now supports pieces of this ancient wisdom. Studies in the past decade reveal that deep sleep mimics several early stages of the dying process, the slowing of consciousness, the temporary withdrawal of sensory input, the dreamlike hallucinations formed from the brain's quieted electrical patterns. Some researchers even propose that humans rehearse death every night without realizing it, and that those who fear death the least are often those who sleep the deepest, the most peacefully. The Egyptians knew. Somehow, thousands of years ago, long before EEG machines and neurological scans, they understood that sleep was a teacher, a bridge, a rehearsal for the final journey. And so they shaped their lives around this understanding, treating each night as a quiet, sacred training for the only passage every human must face. As we continue, we'll go deeper into how they used this knowledge, not just for pharaohs,
but for ordinary people, for entire communities seeking comfort in the darkness, because the final secret was never meant to stay hidden forever. It was meant to guide, to soften, to help us look at sleep and at death with the same calm acceptance the Egyptians carried like a lantern in the night.
When you begin to understand that the Egyptians used sleep as a rehearsal for death, many of their fears, choices, and rituals take on a new meaning. For them, the boundary between the living and the afterlife was not a wall, but a doorway that opened and closed thousands of times throughout a person's life. And the deeper they understood this doorway, the more control they believed they had over the fate awaiting them beyond it. That belief may sound mystical, but to the Egyptians it was practical, something built into their architecture, their medicine, even their daily routines. What makes this even more fascinating is that ancient texts suggest the Egyptians did not intend this knowledge to be limited to kings. There are references to entire communities participating in guided sleep sessions, villagers lying together in quiet chambers, listening to a priest who whispered instructions meant to prepare their minds for the stillness that comes at the end of life. These rites were gentle, almost soothing, designed not to terrify people, but to make them feel held by something larger than themselves. Every inhale was symbolic of life entering the body. Every exhale was a practiced release, a reminder that one day the final exhale would come, and that it did not need to be feared. But somewhere along the centuries, this understanding began to slip away, not erased, but diluted. By the late period, sleep had become more of a religious symbol than a personal training. The practices were preserved, but the meaning behind them grew distant, like a memory heard through water. Priests kept the knowledge, yes, but they guarded it carefully, passing it only to a chosen few. The scrolls describing the deeper purpose of sleep rituals were hidden inside temple walls, written in prose so dense that even scholars of the time struggled to interpret them. And so the teaching slowly dissolved, leaving behind rituals without context, sleeping positions, amulets, incense mixtures that people followed without understanding why. Some historians believe this loss was intentional, that as political instability grew, priests feared the misuse of knowledge that gave people a psychological mastery over death itself. They guarded the secret as though it were a weapon. Others believe the knowledge faded naturally, overshadowed by changing dynasties, foreign invasions, and the slow erosion of cultural memory. Whatever caused it, one thing is certain: the final secret of Egyptian sleep, the idea of practicing death in gentle nightly fragments, was nearly lost forever. What saved it was not ancient records, but modern excavations and scientific breakthroughs. Neuroscientists began studying the boundary between sleep and death, documenting the moments when consciousness flickers in and out of awareness. Their findings echoed what Egyptian priests described thousands of years earlier, that in the transition between waking and dreaming, the brain becomes unusually open, receptive, and vulnerable.
Archaeologists, meanwhile, uncovered temple chambers oriented precisely toward twilight and dawn, reinforcing the idea that Egyptians practiced daily transitions as microversions of the Great Crossing. And together, these modern discoveries cast new light on an old belief that sleep and death are not enemies but siblings, two journeys along the same river, only in different directions. Which brings us to the question the Egyptians would have wanted us to ask. What does this mean for us today? They believed that anyone who learned to fall asleep calmly would learn to live calmly. That the person who could surrender to the darkness each night without panic would greet life's final darkness with the same centered breath. They treated sleep not as passive retreat, but as a skill, one as important as farming, navigating, or healing. And in a world where anxiety steals rest from millions of people, this ancient view suddenly feels surprisingly modern. The Egyptians practiced small forms of letting go every night, so that when the final letting go arrived, it felt familiar, like the closing of a well-worn door after a long journey. And perhaps without realizing it, we are searching for the same peace today.
So, if the Egyptians had one final message for us, one last whisper carried across thousands of years, it would be this: sleep wisely, because sleep shapes the soul. And not just in the way modern people think, as rest or recovery, but as a ritual that quietly molds how we meet fear, how we greet darkness, how we walk through the unknown. Before their civilization faded into sand and silence, the Egyptians seemed to understand a truth humans are only rediscovering now, that every night offers us a chance to practice calmness in the face of uncertainty, that every descent into dreams is a rehearsal for surrender, and that through this daily surrender, people learn to live with a softer heart and a steadier mind. The question then becomes, what pieces of their ancient practice can we carry into the modern world, safely, gently, without superstition? The answer is not in the exotic parts, the stone pillows, the incense toxins, or the ritual chambers, but in the foundation beneath all of it, their relationship with letting go. The Egyptians built their sleep rituals around slow breathing, predictable rhythms, quiet transitions, and environments designed to comfort the mind rather than stimulate it. Those principles remain as valid today as they did 4,000 years ago. And science, in an unexpected harmony with ancient belief, has begun confirming one idea after another. Slow breathing activates the parasympathetic nervous system, easing the body into a state not unlike their second crossing. Darkness and stillness guide the brain into restorative sleep cycles. Releasing control, even symbolically, reduces physical tension and increases the quality of deep sleep. We may not need priests chanting soft phrases at our bedside, but our bodies respond the same way they always have, with softening, loosening, quieting. One of the most astonishing parallels comes from a sleep study published just a few years ago. Researchers found that people who practice nightly micro-surrenders, tiny intentional rituals of release, like slow exhalation, intentional stillness, or imagining burdens drifting away, experience fewer night terrors and deeper rest. The Egyptians had performed these exact rituals millennia earlier, believing them to strengthen the soul's ability to navigate both dreams and death. Their language was spiritual, ours is neurological, but the effect is the same. And then there is the most uncomfortable part of their wisdom, the belief that ignoring fear gives it more power, but facing it gently diminishes it. The Egyptians confronted the fear of death by approaching it in small, manageable pieces each night. Modern psychology teaches the same principle. Exposure reduces fear, avoidance inflames it. Somehow, across vast centuries, the human mind has remained unchanged in the ways it learns courage. So, what can we take forward from all of this? Not the details of their rituals, but the shape of their philosophy. We can choose to treat the moment before sleep not as a collapse into exhaustion, but as a doorway, one we walk through consciously. We can slow our breath, we can dim the lights, we can allow silence to soften the world around us. And for a few heartbeats each night, we can practice letting go, the way the Egyptians once did, not to welcome death, but to welcome peace. For in their eyes, the purpose of these rituals was never morbid, it was healing, it was grounding, it was a way of preparing people to wake with steadier minds and gentler spirits. And if there is a conspiracy buried beneath history, it is not about hiding dangerous knowledge. It is about forgetting useful knowledge. Knowledge that could make our nights easier, our fears smaller, and our lives deeper. If you listen closely, you can almost hear what they might have said, that you do not have to be a pharaoh to sleep like one. You only need to treat your nights with the same reverence they did, slowly, intentionally, with breath as your guide and darkness as your companion. And maybe if you follow this ancient rhythm, you will find that each morning feels a little brighter, each worry a little lighter, each step into your day a little steadier. For sleep, as the Egyptians believed, was not the opposite of life. It was part of life, a teacher, a companion, a quiet rehearsal for peace.